You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast, ladies and gentlemen. Galen Clavio and Scott Caulfield joining you here on the show. It's 9:42 on Sunday, November 26th, and we're doing a special live recording of a podcast here. We just sent the links out across the Back Home Network and out on social media as the news is just broken that Indiana has fired head coach Tom Allen. This was not a surprise to some people. I think perhaps a surprise to some other folks. We're going to talk about the news. We're going to talk about the reaction to the news. And we've got a lot of people joining in now as people have just seen the link. So we'll let people fill in a little bit. Scott, first of all, good to see you again. We had just finished recording our Purdue preview, and we had said, for those who haven't heard it yet, which is none of you because I haven't published it, that we were going to do a
Egyptian hackers might have listened to it.
The Egyptian hackers have already heard it, yes. But we had inside joke, everybody. But we had talked about how, as always, we were going to do a recap podcast for the season. I had an inkling that something was going to happen with this situation, so we were going to wait and maybe do it tonight. But the news broke right as we were wrapping up one of our VIP episodes. So here we are.
When the VIP episode was about donors having money to provide for buyouts, and we were talking about it in Jimbo Fisher terms, but I think that's what was holding a lot of people up on this. Like, I think the results on the field, most people felt like making a change was right. But I think the thing that held a lot of people up, myself included, was like, that's a lot of money for a program like Indiana to get for football. But as our VIP post was talking about, it's like, there is a lot of money out there and a lot of people who care about college athletics. And obviously we were able to get the money needed. And the winner here is Tom Allen as agents. As always, these buyouts are like the agents. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, the big question obviously on this was the balance that you had to strike in your head between Indiana football essentially being dead in the water and Indiana football in the Indiana athletic department not necessarily having the $20 million or so dollars that it would take to buy out Tom Allen. And it's interesting. And I think, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about what we talked about earlier on in the season, which was essentially this idea that nobody thought Tom Allen might be going into his final season at the start of this season. And the primary reason for that was the buyout itself. And this idea that it's Indiana football. This is a program that IU has not given a lot of money, a lot of attention to historically. I think that's changed in the last 10 to 12 years, and we'll get into that a little bit. But the idea that Indiana, of all schools, was going to spend $20+ million to fire a coach so that they could maybe marginally improve the program. This is not my words, but this is essentially the words that were being used at the time. It was like, no, there's no way that happens. They're going to let him have 2 years. He's got 2 years basically to prove himself. They're going to go through the 2024 season, and then if things still haven't improved, the buyout drops to a more manageable $8 million December 1st, 2024. What was interesting, and actually, Dan Carell, I think, deserves credit for bringing this up. I'm going to put, and if you folks want to leave messages, by the way, you can comment on Twitter, you can comment on YouTube, you can comment on Twitch. We're up on Twitch right now as well, and we can put some of your comments up on the board. But Dan mentions Pete Thamel's prediction came true. This is all thanks to the new Big Ten media deal. And what he's talking about is there was an article that popped up back in late August or early September. It was right around the Ohio State game. And out of the blue, it mentioned Tom Allen, had a picture of Tom Allen, and it talked about the idea that, you know what, this is probably a coach that might be in trouble because of all of the money that's coming in to the Big Ten as a result of these new television deals. And the idea that Indiana was going to be, we didn't know at the time that Michigan State was going to be open, that there were going to be a couple of other programs open, Northwestern, but that Indiana was going to be one of the few potentially open jobs in a Big Ten that is increasingly the place to be in college football, either that or the SEC, because of the sheer amount of money, suddenly put Tom Allen on a hot seat that maybe didn't exist before the new television deals got announced and before the addition of Oregon and Washington. And so you have to weave all of that into the mix. as I think about this, Scott, what's really fascinating as we go through and look at how the season went is that it felt like Tom Allen had every opportunity going into this season to give himself another year. I really don't think Indiana wanted to fire Tom Allen. I really don't think that they wanted to go to donors and spend $21 million. But you couldn't watch this season's team, if we're being honest, without just getting the realization that this team was going nowhere. This program was going nowhere. It was a program that was just kind of dead in the water. And it had been basically since the peak of 2020. Since that time, Indiana going 3-24 in the Big Ten. It's just not been an acceptable output of games and play, and it's been just this cycle of coordinators getting fired and coordinators getting replaced and quarterbacks coming and going and all of these different aspects. And as we talk about on our pregame or on the pod where we recap the Purdue game, it just always felt like Indiana was shooting itself in the foot. It always felt like Indiana was not capable of hitting that next level. And it was confusing because the 2019 and 2020 seasons under Tom Allen, it looked like they'd broken through that, only to watch in these last 3 seasons them recede to a level that, frankly, has felt as bad as anything we saw in the DiNardo and Lynch eras.
Yeah, no, for me, what I thought that, I agree with you 100% that, IU did not want to do this. And honestly, they didn't have to do it up until a couple weeks ago. Like after the Wisconsin game, we joked about, being in playoff mode. But, the thing that I thought was interesting was after that Wisconsin game, I think you and Taylor Lehman talked about it, but it's something that I think a lot of people, were in the same boat as me, where it's like, man, if we win the next 4 games, the 3 after Wisconsin, it's like, we'll make a bowl. And then Tom Allen gets a 1-year extension. And like, how would you feel about that? I think we all kind of came to grips where it's like, that's fine. Like, I want to win. Like, it doesn't matter who the coach is. I'd like to have a successful program, but in that process of thinking of, I think everybody had I'm going to speak for myself, but I think a lot of people were in my shoes where it's like, I do just want to win, but it's like, I felt like, damn, like it may have gotten too far where I'm not even sure I could, 6-6. It's like, they obviously wouldn't fire Allen, but it's like, I'd be like, damn, like we got to do another year of this. Like, it was like I had been burned too many times. And I think a lot of people were in that same boat. Now, of course, we went ahead and just lost the next 3 and it didn't become a moot point. But to your point, like if Indiana wins after what, this is November 4th, if they win the rest of those games, which were all winnable games Indiana was in, we're going to a bowl and we're not having this discussion. So it's not like this is a fait accompli from 2 or 3 months ago. Like, and I think honestly, even when they lost to Illinois, had they picked themselves up off the mat and beat Michigan State and beaten Purdue, it's probably a different discussion as well. So, I mean, this was, unfortunately, it's again, everything is a microcosm of itself. It's like,
right.
He waited till his back was completely against the wall. And it's like, just, can you take the smallest little tiny bit of positive out of this? And we weren't able to do it. And then you lose out again. And it's like, yeah, I mean, the 3-year stretch, it was kind of something I did earlier in the pod. I'll pull up the stats here in a sec, but it started when you would always talk about how the DiNardo era was kind of like the
nadir of IU football. Yes.
And beginning of the year, I started thinking like, well, shit, we're not like our record isn't that far off from the DiNardo. Like he's going to have to do some work this year to get there. And he didn't. And it's like, that's where it kind of got to me. And yeah, this is the worst 3-year stretch of any coach we've had since, Mallory.
Well, and that's the thing. I think a lot of people, this has been a really complicated career arc. Sam Beiseisen on Twitter had a really good note about this. Like, this has been really hard, I think, for people to get their heads wrapped around. Like, for a lot of IU fans, the glow of the 2019 and 2020 seasons still shines brightly, and rightfully so. Those were 2 of the best seasons in program history. Yeah. And Tom Allen and his coaching staff deserve credit for making those things happen. But that was literally 3 full seasons ago. And the problem is, you cannot afford to take steps backward. Taylor Lehman of Bite Size Bison had a really revealing chart where he looked at like the aggregate talent levels that Indiana's been able to pull in. And it's been about the same since about year 4 of the Kevin Wilson era. IU's had the talent essentially to win 6-7 games a year. And they did that under the last 2 years of Kevin Wilson. They got close in the first 2 years of Tom Allen. They exceeded it in the 2 years after that. And then in the last 3 seasons, they've won 3 total Big Ten games. And they just haven't been a competitive football program. And I think for a lot of fans, it's hard to reconcile that with how much they want and wanted the Tom Allen era to succeed. And we've talked about this many times on the show. Tom Allen, likable guy in the media, seems very passionate about IU, like really is like Mr. IU behind the scenes. And that's what IU fans, like the hardcore football fans, always wanted. They wanted this coach that was going to like love IU and be there just for IU and was going to build IU into something. And I think what's so disappointing about this end to Tom Allen is that it felt like Indiana had gotten there.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, it's still hard to reconcile in their brains that that's not what happened. That there's an alternate explanation for what happened with IU football over the last 7 years, where instead of Tom Allen building this into a competitive program, Tom Allen, unfortunately, lost a lot of the things that made the program good for those 2 years, made a lot of mistakes along the way. And while his perspective and, his belief in the LEO culture and all of that didn't waver, what did waver was his actual management of the program. And this is where it's tough. It sucks as a business because it has to be looked at as a business. And you can like Tom Allen as a human. You can think Tom Allen is the type of coach that you want running your program, but you have to have realistically an idea that you are doing what you need to do on a weekly basis to be competitive in the Big Ten. And that just hasn't happened. And it's not just about the wins and losses. It's about the way the team has won and lost those games. It's about the way the team has struggled to compete. When they have won games in the Big Ten, it's been almost flukish over the course of the last 3 years. You can't look at the 3 wins and say, wow, they should have had several more. You look at the 3 wins, you're like, they're lucky they had those. And that's just not a tenable position for an IU football program that had climbed out of the muck, was not in that kind of Cameron, DiNardo, Lynch era where they were essentially, to quote Al Borges, from back in the day, drowning in their own spit. Like, this was a program that made 2 bowls under Kevin Wilson, made 2 bowls under Tom Allen, and to watch that recede to the degree that it has in such a short period of time, for all the people that talked about wanting to give Tom Allen more time, it's like, this is a business where if you can't show some level of improvement in a 3-year span, it's probably not going to happen. Like, the idea that you're suddenly going to figure things out really doesn't seem plausible. And I think with Allen, he had plenty of opportunities and he kept making wrong decisions. This season was kind of a microcosm, Scott, starting with that starting quarterback situation where, you look at how that was so hideously mismanaged. You think about the time that was lost. If either you're going to commit to Taven Jackson or commit to Brendan Sorsby, you commit to the guy who ends up not being the guy that starts at the end, you lose all those reps and all of those things that you could do to potentially win the Michigan State game or win the Illinois game. And that suddenly changes the whole perspective of the season. But time and time again over these last 3 years, it felt like Allen made the wrong choices. Those directly reflected on the way that his teams prepared, the way that his teams performed. And it's hard to get away from just the reality that IU just hadn't done enough to put themselves in a position to be competitive. And when Northwestern can fire their coach before the season starts and still make a bowl, and Indiana comes in to a season where they had plenty of winnable games on their schedule and wins 3 games overall, that's a real bad sign.
Yeah, I mean, you just said this, but I talked about this earlier in the season, or I think in the preview. The thing that really was tough with this was it really did feel like we came out of the muck. And Kevin Wilson's second year from 2012 to 2020, here's our win total year over year. It was 4, 5, 4, 6, 6, 5, 5, and 8. And that felt like, all right, like we've kind of at least come up with a new floor of this program that we're going to win 4 or 5 games a year. And it's like we did that for, a 7-8 year period. And then it's like, wow, then we had a pop, like things lined up right. It's like we had a couple good coordinators. We had a great quarterback. And it's like you popped. And that's, to me, that's what Indiana football kind of needs to be in that spot where it's like you're kind of an average program and then things line up right once every decade and you pop and then you kind of go back to that 4, 5, 6 win, level. And then it's just like, and it's like, okay, like there was more than 1 year where you could be like, all right, I believe this is now the new floor. We have kind of a new basis. And then it just all gets pulled away, like completely just rug pulled out from under you, not even a slow decline, just a complete dead cat bounce. And, the thing that people would at least reach to is like, you look at, Northwestern under Pat Fitzgerald, they would have high highs and then low lows. So maybe you were hoping that maybe this is just a 1 year one-off, like things just all went wrong. But as you mentioned, it's like it just didn't feel that way. Like everything seemed off. All the decisions seemed wrong. They seemed to at times antagonize the fan base. But I mean, it's hard to square it because it was two of the best years Indiana football has had, and that is true. But as you said, it's not something where you can just dine off of that forever. And I don't want to minimize it because they were two great years. But even like the comparisons like a Pat Fitzgerald or programs like that, it's like he at least did something. Like I'm not being mean here, but like 2 IU years were great, but you don't have a bowl win, you don't have a Big Ten championship game, although that we kind of got screwed out of that, but you have a Big Ten title, but you don't go to a Rose Bowl. I mean, like you look at it's like we had 2 good years, but not a lot to show for it. And I'm not trying to denigrate those years, but it's just like putting it into context that had Allen won the Gator Bowl and the Outback Bowl, like won both of those games, maybe he gets an even longer runway. But when the stakes are high and when you're doing this poor, suddenly everything you have to look at with a little bit tighter of a magnifying glass.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, there's a lot to digest. And, it was interesting because in mid-October, late October, I still didn't think that there was going to be any kind of a change made. And even with the lack of bowl wins or other success, it just kind of felt like Indiana was going to create a situation where it wasn't financially feasible or it didn't make sense given that it was going to be more financially feasible the following year. But there's a couple of things worth noting on this. And this is something that we tried to talk about earlier on in the podcast season. First of all, I mean, Chi-Town JJ on Twitch brought up a good point, which is that, the $20 million is spread over 4 years. It's not like you're paying a Jimbo Fisher lump sum. It's always been one of those situations. Tom Allen's going to get another job. If he's not on Hugh Freeze's staff, special teams coordinator, which it looks like they need after what happened last night in that Alabama game, assuming Hugh Freeze is still the coach this morning. I'm not sure, I haven't checked yet. But Tom Allen's going to land another job. It's going to mitigate some of the contract salary. But more important than that, in this new era of college football, IU has to start taking their football program more seriously. And this is really where it starts. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of IU not properly supporting the football program from a financial perspective. Now, I think there are some legitimate complaints. The practice facility situation needs to be addressed. There's a couple of other things, but IU has andied up on multiple occasions now with head coach contracts. They've certainly raised the bar on assistant coach contracts. They're not quite there yet, but you have to separate the idea that IU was like deliberately undercutting Tom Allen versus the idea that Tom Allen wasn't getting the job done with resources that would make programs elsewhere blush. I mean, this is one of those situations where I feel like a lot of the Allen defenders or people who are just out to criticize the athletic department, and there are many, have tended to overstate the difficulty of the financial situation at IU and understate the culpability that the head coach and the coaching staff have on doing things with what they've got. I mean, with the same level of, actually with fewer resources, Kevin Wilson was able to build the program up to a program that won, 6 games twice in a row. And look, Kevin Wilson wasn't a saint by any means, but the idea that you just couldn't win or that you couldn't compete in this environment, I've never bought. The idea that IU was somehow shorting football in terms of name, image, and likeness money compared to Ohio State, sure, but a lot of programs do that. There's a lot more name, image, and likeness money out there. I think you have to acknowledge to some degree the idea that players didn't necessarily at this point want to come play for Tom Allen. And that's hard to reconcile with that video of everybody running off the field after the Wisconsin game and saying, hey, best coach in America. But the reality is, think about what happened over the course of the last 3 years. Indiana, they hire an offensive coordinator that didn't have a lot of experience. They fire him midseason. They go out and replace him with a guy who was a middling offensive coordinator and then became one of the worst coaches by record in all of college football in Walt Bell. Then they fire him halfway through his second season. They replace him with a guy who did better work, but realistically, that's still an unattractive offense. I mean, you look at what Indiana did this year. They had one of the most dynamic athletes in FBS football, and they couldn't figure out a way to get him the football. Yeah. They screwed around. They've had, 6 starting quarterbacks in the last 3 years, Scott, I think is the number, 6 or 7. And one of those guys is in the middle of a Heisman chase at Washington. One of them transferred to Michigan. One of them got chased off after half a year and is at Bowling Green, where he led an upset of Georgia Tech on the road. One of them was, decided to not play quarterback at all anymore. And then this year, you went out and got a transfer quarterback who you then benched after 4 games after naming him the permanent starter. And then you had to bring the guy in who you told wasn't the starter and make him the starter. I mean, just that you look at and you're like, why would anybody voluntarily choose, even if there was NIL money on the table, to come in and play? Why, if you were here and you saw the way that things were operating and you saw that you'd won 3 Big Ten games over the course of 3 seasons, like Tom Allen spent a lot of time in the post-game press conference talking about re-recruiting your own players. Well, what is it about playing for IU right now under Tom Allen over these last 3 seasons that's attractive? This is just the reality of the business. And again, it's not a personal thing with Tom Allen. We've said that many times, but it is a business thing. And business-wise, IU football is not good business right now if you're a player. What is attractive about it under Tom Allen? They bring in all of these defensive transfers, and it's the same thing. It's like some of those guys played well and got opportunities. Other guys got benched. Other guys didn't play. It's felt so much in flux that I think a lot of people have just taken the explanation that, IU didn't properly support Tom Allen at face value, when in reality, IU gave Tom Allen a pretty wide berth to do what he wanted to do, and he really wasn't able to do much with what he had. And that ultimately is why we're sitting here talking about this today.
Don't forget, on the quarterback thing, you also had a starting quarterback of a Power 5 team just say, I want to be a wide receiver.
Right. I mentioned that. Yes, absolutely.
Often, I'm not sure if that's happened in the last 20 years. But to the business side, the thing that I was thinking about last night is, that IU is not too, with Steve Fisher here saying, IU is not too undesirable. No, you look at what happened with Michigan State. So they just hired Jonathan Smith. And to me, my takeaway from that is, you can split hairs here, but for nothing else, Oregon State to Michigan State is in the previous iteration of football, that's a lateral move. Especially what Jonathan Smith played at Oregon State. He's an alumnus. In the last 2 years, he's gone 18-7, 6-3, and 5-4 in the Pac-12. Like, he has that program ranked. He has that program running. He went to that school. There's no world where he leaves Oregon State for kind of a dumpster fire of a Michigan State program. But the reason that he does is because Michigan State is one of 30 jobs that's in the SEC or the Big Ten. Like, it's a very high commodity. And as I saw that, it's like, wow, this is starting to all not come into focus for me, but it's like, this is what's going to happen is like, I always brush against the idea.
Bristle. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. It's still, NyQuil this morning. I bristle against the idea of like, man, who would want to come to IU? It's like, I can name any coach not in the top 29. Like, any coach that's not coaching in the SEC or the Big Ten now would want to come to IU if IU is going to use their resources correctly and actually put them out there. But you look at what Michigan State did, and it's like, that shows we can get these guys. And this is a very valuable commodity, a head coaching job in the Big Ten. There's not a lot of them out there. And I'm happy to see Indiana looking at this and saying, this is something that's too valuable to just waste another year just to save some money. And so I think, now comes the obviously you got to hire the right person, but it's like, I look at that as like, you're going to be able to get somebody good if you can do things correctly.
I mean, that's the thing. I think to some degree, it's about taking your football program seriously, which we talked about earlier on. And there's 2 different sides. There's really multiple sides, but 2 that we'll talk about here. the idea that you look at the results of the last 3 years, and like Chi-Town JJ had another good point, which we just put up a second ago, which is like the 3 years that Tom Allen has gotten, that and the lack of success over these 3 years, that wouldn't happen at most places. Like
Right.
he would have been gone after last year, and it was essentially the buyout that kept him in place, and that there was so little progress made. In fact, I think you could argue there was regression in this season in a bunch of different areas. That just doesn't bode well for the future. You have to take your football program more seriously from that perspective. If you have some head coaches just can't do it, and I think there's reasons we can get into, which we'll talk about in a second. That I'd like to talk about with why it went wrong with Allen. But this has to be the start. If you're going to fire Tom Allen with $21 million on your the buyout, you're going to have to spend a lot of money now to go hire a good replacement. You're going to have to spend money on getting the rest of your facilities up to par. You're going to have to essentially not look at Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State, because they're in a different income class than you. But you have to look at the Illinois, you have to look at the Minnesotas, you have to look at the Northwesterns, you have to look at the Rutgers, the Minnesota or the Marylands. You have to say, okay, this is the group of teams that we have to at least be in the mix with, because you're adding 4 football brands,
putting us down the pecking
that are just bringing you fully down the echelon. There's nothing that says Indiana can't be a successful football program. There are models out there. People think of Wisconsin as this, natural force that's always been around in the Big Ten. Wisconsin was terrible until the early 1990s. They make the right hire, they make the right investments, and they get on this upward trajectory, and they continue to feed the beast. Iowa's another good example. I mean, Iowa's always been kind of in the mix at a level or two above IU, but the fact that they've stabilized into essentially one of the 4 most reliable brands, there are routes to doing this.
Recruiting advantage that we don't.
Right. And so when I think about this move, it's a beginning. And as much as we've talked over the course of the last several weeks, the last couple of years really, about IU absolutely has to take not just this seriously, but they have to recognize when things are going wrong and act decisively. We talked about it in basketball as well. We talked about how IU had to seize their destiny, because IU historically has had this kind of philosophy with their head coaches at the major sports, where they just let them run the program for better or worse. They go out and hire someone. It's like, hey, it's your program. You do what you want. It's a coach's dream. Right. It's a coach's dream in a lot of ways. And it also puts the university in a position where you're always at fault if things don't go right. And that's just not a good way to go about things. And if you look around the landscape of college football, you have to look at it as a profession. You have to look at it as a business. It's a professional sport. We had talked about this in our VIP episode that we just finished taping before the news broke. You can't think about it as, we're going to give this guy a long runway, this or that. There's not time. It's very much like what happens in the professional ranks in the NFL. You have to have a core that says, okay, this is what the program is, and the coach is there to augment it positively. And if that doesn't work, we need to figure out a way to move on to the next person. But with IU, it's more complicated, because you have to build the foundation first and foremost. And that's what Indiana's been missing. And that's where it's clear that, unfortunately, I think you could interpret the Allen era as Allen took over a program that had started to build that foundation, worked with it for a while, made some good coordinator hires, that first set of coordinators that he really fully vested in. When those guys were gone, everything changed, and you found out that the core elements of the program, the structures that have to be there if you're going to sustain, weren't there. And that essentially what you were dealing with was an IU football program that didn't have anything to lean on. Like there was no foundation. And I think that's the risk that you run when you hire a guy like Tom Allen, who is very much, as we've talked about, he's a vibes-based guy. It's all about emotion. There's a thing there about you have to have the experience of having run a program to know what to build at a place like Indiana, where the structures that you can take for granted at a lot of places just aren't there. And that's not a great place to be, but it was clear that Allen was not able to handle that in this particular situation. And that's a shame, because I think everybody, ourselves included, wanted him to succeed. It just wasn't to be. And at this point, you're just you're beating a dead horse if you're expecting something to change based upon what we've seen over the last few years.
Yeah, no, I think your point about a shorter runway is so apt. It's funny, but it's like seeing what Michigan State did, plucking a team, Arizona or Oregon State, just being like, I got to go to a bigger program. There is a world where, like, earlier in the year, had Washington and Oregon not come to the Big Ten, this would be a pretty easy, like, all right, Kalen DeBoer, come on over. But like, he's about to have a Big Ten job, and so that doesn't help us too much. But no, I agree with all of that, and it is. The two things can be true. One is that Allen did a great job of, hiring coordinators and getting Michael Penix to where he needed to be and building off the foundation that had been kind of that long runway of Kevin Wilson. He did a great job in 2018, 2019, and 2020. It can also be true that he did a pretty poor job after that, and it seemed like he wasn't able to go back to what are we good at? Like that's the thing when you talk about Wisconsin or Iowa. You can make fun of Iowa all you want. They go 10-3 every year. It's like when they come down to it, it's like, all right, we know our core is defense and tight end play, and like we're just going to focus and double down on that and just be unbelievably, skilled at not making mistakes and just being fundamentally sound. It felt like over the last 3 years, Allen was grasping at trying to, what is Indiana football and what is it going to make us successful? I think that was the frustrating part. I know for myself is it'd be one thing if he's like, hey, this is what we do, and it wasn't working, and just like, kept doubling down and be like, well, that's a different kind of problem. With Allen, it's like you mentioned, the quarterbacks were all over the place. Like we go from, we have one game of success against Michigan State, and suddenly now we're running the wishbone or triple option. It's like, wait, what? We were never good with that, under what you had. And then it's like, the times we were successful with Penix, we had a pretty dynamic offense. But now that we're struggling, we're just going to turn into a run first up the middle program. And that was more frustrating to me, as it seemed like he was just really grasping at straws and trying anything that had success. Like, that's going to be our thing. And it's like, that's in year 7, you shouldn't be doing that. You should just be saying, hey, we are fundamentally, this is what we do. We do this. And I'm not using examples because for the last 3 years, I don't know what we did. Like, I don't know what we were good at. I don't know what our team focus was. Like, we were just scatterbrained to the point that it's like, this is not a long-term sustainable. Like I said, there's a world where, like, if you're Hayden Fry, you can get fired, but you're at least he's doing what he knows he can do. And it's like, I know at least I can do this. It felt like in the last 3 years, Allen really didn't know what the answer was. And that to me was the most troubling part.
I think it's worth, and we've gotten some great comments coming in from all of you. I can't post them all. And when I do post them, I keep covering Scott's face up, which I would call that's a feature, not a bug. But no, I'm kidding. But I do think it's interesting. I've tried, as I've thought about the possibility of Tom Allen being fired, I've tried to think about, like, where did it all go wrong? Like, really? And to me, there's this sequence of events that happens that you have to zero in on. Obviously, I think to me, the first domino that fell, where Indiana really got rolling, was when Tom Allen removed himself from the defensive coordinator position and put Kane Womack in full time at that role, and when Mike DeBoer retired and they hired Kalen DeBoer. And suddenly in that 2019 season, I remember us being shocked at how well everything gelled. And it wasn't immediate. They struggled in the first game against Ball State. They got blown out by Ohio State. But down the stretch, that team was like very few IU teams I've seen. That was a throwback to like the early 90s when it was like you could rely on things to work offensively and defensively. DeBoer leaves and goes to be a head coach. And we talked about it at the time going into that offseason. It's like, this is where IU needs to act like a big-time program and go get a top-level offensive coordinator. And what did Tom Allen do? He decided to roll the dice with Nick Sheridan the same way that he'd rolled the dice with Kane Womack. Did he you can justify that choice. You can say, well, look, Allen struck gold once. Maybe he just has a way with these young coordinators. And even though IU, obviously, the following year with Sheridan had a great season, realistically speaking, it was largely due to Michael Penix propping them up for most of the season, and the fact that COVID caused everybody in the Big Ten to be as kind of non-detail oriented as Indiana normally is. And so then, obviously, Indiana gets screwed at the end of the season. They don't get put in the Big Ten title game. IU and Tom Allen, it's almost like they passed it along into the dark side there for a little bit. They removed the patches from the jerseys going into the Outback Bowl.
I know,
and
bad move.
It was such an uncharacteristic for a program built on love.
Yep.
It was such an uncharacteristic, like, well, we're going to show them kind of thing. And it almost felt like from that point forward, everything went wrong.
Yeah.
And you think about the other things that happened during this general
vibes up to that point. Like, he was a positive vibes guy, and that was so uncharacteristic. Anyway, go ahead.
I mean, you think about all the other things that happened during, and that's just one of those deals, but it's like, you think about the other things that happened during that stretch of time, leading into that 2020 season. You lose David Ballou and Matt Ray, the strength and conditioning coaches. They go to Alabama. Great opportunity for them. Aaron Wellman gets hired. And I don't think anybody can look at Indiana now physically versus where Indiana was under Ballou and Ray and not say, wow, there are some significant fall downs in that. Like, the tackling's not there, the physicality's not there, the injuries have spiked. And then you get this series of really questionable moves. You get the hiring of Charlton Warren as the defensive coordinator, and then he's gone after a season. And there's rumors of, he wasn't running the defense that Allen wanted him to run. And so then Allen inserts himself back to
be a coordinator.
And then he goes out and hires Guerreri.
Well, I just want to highlight that point real quick. Like, that was a real concern point for me, because again, it's not understanding what was making you successful. And that when Allen took a step back, because when he started as head coach, he was still tinkering with defensive coordinator position. When he had his success is when he stepped out of being the coordinator and just became the head coach. Yeah. And it was really concerning that as we started to struggle, he went back to things like that. Hey, that wasn't working. Like, when you go back to 18, 19, 20, that wasn't the magic elixir that you had. It's like, why are you doing things that were unsuccessful? Like, do more things that were successful.
Well, there was an inherent stubbornness to Tom Allen. And I think you see this in a lot of coaches. Coaches will generally, in football especially, they will always default back to what they think is at the core of how they understand the game of football. And they will and for Allen, and we talked about this in the first 2 years, like, people have forgotten, like, one of the frustrating things about IU football in 2017 and 2018 was how conservative the offense was and how it seemed to be there to serve the defense. And yet the defense was never able ultimately to pull off the plays needed to win the game that Indiana had to have, whether it was the Minnesota game up in Minnesota, whether it was the first bucket game or the second bucket game. And there were, the Maryland game, one of those years. I mean, there were enough instances like that where you're like, well, this is kind of frustrating. Allen, it felt like post 2020 really, decided we're going to focus on doing things that he thought were going to win games, not maybe realizing that the game had changed and that a lot of the things that he knew to be successful from earlier, including his defensive structure, might not be that successful now. And it just made for a bunch of weird things that happened throughout this whole time period. I mean, Michael Penix getting rushed back, and we see interviews about Penix like crying on the floor of his apartment because he's not ready to play, and it's like, how is that guy out there playing quarterback? You see McCullough come back as a running backs coach and then just leave. It was very odd. Like, why did that happen? And yes, he got the opportunity at Notre Dame, but like, he probably could have had that at almost any time. It was very odd that it occurred the way that it did. And just incident after incident down the line, where when you looked at what IU did and the way that IU did it, it created a situation where Allen would make a mistake and then compound the mistake by doubling down on the wrong things. And it's almost one of those, it felt like as we were watching it happen, Scott, it's like, can we please save Tom Allen from himself? Can we please just say, look, Tom, you've got to be the CEO here. You've got to make the big picture decisions, but you have to hire good people, let them do what they do, and understand what's going to contribute the most to success, given the talent level that you've got at Indiana. And it just felt like he went the opposite direction on so many of those things throughout the course of the last 3 years that it left Indiana in a spot where it is right now. And it's just a shame. It didn't have to be that way, but it did feel like it was just going to compound itself even more if this continued throughout the course of this upcoming offseason.
No, because the other thing that, Taylor Lehman gets credit for really highlighting this beginning of this year, this team was like 90%, just so many transfers. Like, when you look at the Big Ten last year, the number of, snaps lost to the portal, it was Indiana by a country mile. And the only other team close was Purdue, who had a coaching change, which is pretty, as we'll see, you're going to see a lot of turnover with the coaching change.
Yeah.
But Indiana, it's like for a coach in his 6th year should not be astronomically higher in transfer portal. Like every other team was like, number of snaps lost was, like 50 or 100. And we were like 2000. It was orders of magnitude higher. But the frustrating part with that is this is coming on the heels of 5 years of getting better recruiting classes year after year after year, but none of it hit the field. Like that again should have been a massive alarm bell. Is you had a good run. Some of the best recruiting classes we've had have come under Tom Allen. That is a true fact. The trouble is you were not getting the development or getting those guys onto the field, and the ones that you did get would immediately transfer to Notre Dame or somewhere else. And so it's like that was the question I feel like wasn't asked enough at the beginning of this year, is like, how on the heels of 6 of your best recruiting classes are you dipping into the portal this much? Like, why do you need this many portal transfers when you've had great recruiting classes? And, this is where, the old line, like that's what the money's for. Like, I don't particularly feel awful for Tom Allen, but it's like, this is where if you sell this right, it's like I use a really good job because there's not a ton of pressure. Like everyone thinks like none of these questions were really asked of Tom Allen. Like nobody really hit him of like, why are you doing this? Year 6, why do you have this many transfers? Like it just doesn't his time at mismanagement. He wasn't really held to the fire that much compared to coaches like like Hayden Fry or guys in other spots. Like it's a pretty easy gig. You're not going to get a lot of blowback, and if you win a couple games, people are going to leave you alone.
I think it's a great point. I mean, this is, for as much as people talk about IU being a hard job, it is a hard job in terms of you've got a lot of structural issues that you have to address and fix. The reality is it's a very low pressure job in college. As much as we hear about like, oh, Chris Holtmann would have never coached at IU basketball because he doesn't want the pressure. He'd rather be at Ohio State. It's like IU is kind of that. If you're like, I mean, Tom Allen won 8 games once and he went 6-2 another year, and people thought that he walked on water. And that was after 2 5-7 seasons where people were a little frustrated, but if he had done the same thing at Michigan State in his first 2 seasons, people would have been like, why is this guy the head coach?
Yeah.
So,
and I know it's not the same world, but it's like Ryan Day has gone 11-1 3 straight years, and like there's a lot of pressure right now.
Not the same reality, but
it's like that's another Big Ten school, and it's like yeah.
Someone brought up Matt Uhl brought up an interesting point, and I think it's worth bringing up. It was like, I'd argue not doing a national search after Wilson was unquestionably let go was the first domino. We're reaping the sowing of an unqualified candidate being elevated. He wasn't prepared. And this is where it's tough because we did. We talked about this idea that ultimately there's 2 ways to interpret the Allen era. There's the interpretation of, wow, he took what Wilson had and elevated it. But there's also the argument that, well, actually, does 2019 happen if he doesn't have 2 future head coaches as his coordinators? And yes, he deserves some credit for hiring them. But at the end of the day, if you look at the fact that he never made a bowl without at least one of those guys being a coordinator, and they were only here for a couple of years combined, there's a separate interpretation there, I guess, is my point. And
to Matt's point, like we don't need to dig too deep, but it was, you and I mentioned at the time, and a lot of football fans who are really plugged in noticed this. Like, it was a weird, you had Wilson fired for kind of murky reasons. Let's say it wasn't because of performance on the field, it was for other things, but Wilson was fired after the bucket game, before we were going to the bowl. And then Allen wasn't just hired, it wasn't just given the interim tag. He was just head coach, full stop. And it's like, you and I both had kind of like, well, this is interesting. Like, well, let's see how it works out. Then of course, Allen goes on to lose the bowl, the first bowl. But it's like, that was again, taking this seriously. Like, if you're a real high level, gonna be a big boy program, you don't just give somebody the head coach job in the same press conference where you're firing your coach. Like, you fire your coach, fine, Allen's interim until the bowl, and then we're going to take a breath. Well, the fact we can still hire.
And look, I think Fred Glass gets unfairly criticized on a lot of things, but I do think that he is open for criticism with the idea that he hired Tom Allen. And I remember the statement, and it was a direct statement or whatever. It was like, I feel like I found my coach Mallory. And that and this was actually mentioned in one of the, Brian Toohey had this comment, how Tom Allen was hired in the first place shows how low pressure the IU football job was/is, and it's true. And again, it was mentioned earlier, this happened with Bill Lynch. And instead of having a national search after the interim year, they just hire Bill Lynch without thinking there really needs to be a person that clearly has a track record of winning at this level, of building a program, of managing a program at this level. And I guess maybe, Scott, because we don't want to go forever here, that maybe should transition into what a lot of people in the comments have been talking about, which is, okay, where does Indiana go from here? I'm going to state my philosophy on this, and let's just talk. I want to hear yours as well, but you and I have talked about this enough. I think our philosophies are the same.
You're going to steal. Yeah, go for it.
I've watched IU football for 40 years. I've covered it closely. We've podcasted about it for the last 15 years. I've studied about as, unfortunately, I think the only person who's probably studied more IU football history is Ken Bykoff. And, Ken's clearly wearing the miles just as much as I am and you are from that. Maybe Don Fisher is the only other one.
Or Don, yeah.
But from my perspective, Indiana University is a place you can win. It's a place you can build a program. Not along the lines of an Ohio State or a Michigan. Probably never will get to that point. But there's no reason why you can't be a solidly middle-tier Big Ten program, even in this new reality. But Indiana is the worst possible place for a first-time Power 5 head coach to go coach. I feel the same way about Purdue. If you'll notice, where has Purdue been successful in their hires over the course of the last 30 years? They went out and hired Joe Tiller. Joe Tiller wasn't a Power 5 coach, but it was a little different in the 90s. That was a proven coach who had a proven track record, had a system that worked. They went out and hired Jeff Brom. Jeff Brom was a proven coach, again, not quite at the Power 5 level, but that was a guy that you had a feeling was going to go places. And Western Kentucky is kind of one of those mid-range programs where it's like some of that stuff translates. When they hired the coach from Toledo, that didn't work. When Ryan Walters, first-time head coach, I don't think that's going to work. For Indiana, they've constantly decided to make hires that haven't made a lot of sense for the reality of things. Their most successful hire prior to Tom Allen was Bill Mallory, who was a guy who was the head coach at Colorado for several years. Knew what it was like to coach at a high level in college football. And that, from my perspective, especially in the new reality of college football, is how Indiana has to approach this. There are several coaches out there who have coached at a Power 5 school and are either out of coaching or have had to take a step back because they got fired because they weren't good enough for a Florida or a Texas. Realistically speaking, those types of coaches could do really well at Indiana, and most of those coaches would be like, wait, a Big Ten job? I get all the financial resources of a Big Ten job? That is a place that I would consider going in a way that now you might not consider going to an ACC school or a Big 12 school or a Mountain West school because the resources just aren't there. You could get lucky with a head coach that you hire from a smaller conference. I mean, Terry Hepner looked like he was moving things in somewhat the right direction, but realistically speaking, what you're talking about is an IU program, especially if you're going to spend this amount of money, where you really can't roll the dice, in my opinion, on a guy who's never been a head coach, because it's too hard to learn how to be a head coach at this level of college football and build the structure at Indiana. You could get lucky, but why not, if you've already spent $21 million here, spend the extra money, get someone who has worked in this situation, put them in charge, and give them the resources that they need. And that would be how I would approach things. What are your thoughts?
No, we've talked about this before. We're very much in the same boat. When you look at when Indiana was successful, they hired coaches who were head coaches before. And I'm just rephrasing something, the way you just said it. But especially in football, even unlike any other sport, head coach it sounds so simple, but it's so hard for people to understand. Head coach is a different job than coordinator. It just is. And you see it too often. We saw it with Cam Cameron during our time in college. You saw it with Kevin Wilson the first couple of years. He had to understand how to take his hand out of the offense and just be the head coach. You saw it with Tom Allen throughout his career, just had a hard time understanding that the head coach is a different job than the coordinator, and you need to step back. It sounds so simple, but we've seen it time and time again that when we hire a coach, like Wilson's a great example. He started to get things rolling, but it took 2 years for him to kind of figure out like, oh, and he was at Oklahoma. He was a big time coordinator, but it's like he had to realize like, oh, this is a different head coach. You're running the entire organization. And it sounds simple, but we see it time and time again. It's really hard to do that. And, I just don't think exactly what you said, given the money we paid, you can't just kind of go ahead and burn 2 more seasons trying to have somebody figure that out. You need somebody who's plug and play ready, who it's like, all right, we at least know this person can be a head coach. And like you said, you can get lucky. Well, Kalen DeBoer got, it worked out in Washington. Like he knows how to do it. Like you could get lucky, but I'm with you. Like this is not a situation where you don't need to try and strike gold and get lucky and find the next Nick Saban. It's like, just go hit a single, go get it. Cause by the way, like sorry, I don't want to say it, but it's like, just go get the guy who is going to do well, get you a single or a double. And I agree with you. Like now is the time not to be tight with your money. If there is a good coach out there who fits that profile of, somebody who had a power job and kind of stepped back, but knows how to head coach and has a system and has a vision, if it costs a little bit more, go do it. And by the way, people who are going to clutch their pearls, like that person's going to get a buyout too. Like our next coach is going to have a big buyout as well. Like that is the reality of college football today.
It's a very expensive business, and you're not only buying out Tom Allen, you're also buying out his assistants, and you're gonna have to hire a new staff, and you're gonna have to hire a head coach who's gonna be like, you just fired a head coach that had a $21 million buyout. I want financial security. I want that deal.
Point, yeah.
And you're gonna have to pay it probably, but that's not a reason to not do the task, which is what Indiana did, and I'm proud of them for doing that. I think maybe it represents a turning of a new leaf. I do think that there are certainly people are bringing up individual exceptions. Someone said that the pedigree that I just outlined reminds them of Jerry DiNardo. I would push back on that in that DiNardo, immediately started failing at LSU. He had 2 good seasons, and then he went 3-8 and 3-8. He's the losingest coach in XFL history. That was a buddy hire when they couldn't get Mike Riley. People have to remember what the sequence was there. And that was also a much different era of college football. There's also coordinators that have gone on to great success. People have mentioned Kalen DeBoer, who had 1 season at Fresno State as a head coach, and then Washington was like, we want that guy. And there's some people you can tell, and you might get that person at IU, and it might work. I just don't think it's if you can avoid doing that, if you can instead hire somebody who's run a good program somewhere before, I think that is a smarter and more feasible move as you move forward. And look, here's the thing. There's a lot of people out there, a couple of people that have been named in the chat that you and I have talked about behind the scenes. I've been on the Tom Herman train for a while as a possible name. I mean, this is a guy who in 6 years as a head coach prior to this year he's 22-4 at Houston. He was 32-18 at Texas. That wasn't good enough at Texas. Sure. He's at Florida Atlantic. I mean, that's a guy who I think would be worth looking at. Dan Mullen did wonders at Mississippi State, a program that is notoriously as hard to win at in the SEC as Indiana is in the SEC. Was not as good at Florida, but we've heard his name bandied about for jobs like Syracuse over the course of the last week or so. There's no reason why you wouldn't look at a guy like that and say, let's bring that person in. There's coaches like Jed Fish, who's done a tremendous job at Arizona so far, doesn't have a particularly high buyout, and is going to be looking at things and saying, well, do I want to stay at Arizona? I might have a slightly clearer path to a playoff in the Big 12, but would I rather go to Indiana and have the additional financial resources? I mean, that's a possibility. There's several different names. There's former Big 10 coaches. I mean, I'll throw Pat Fitzgerald's name out there. I'll throw Paul Christ's name out there, a guy who everybody kind of cringes at, but go look at Paul Christ's record, both at Pittsburgh and at Washington. He spent the last year as an offensive assistant at Texas. That's a guy who is clearly trying to reinvent himself and get back into a Power 5 job. I mean, you've got a lot of coaches like that. You've also got coaches, Adam Allfield mentions Willie Fritz as a possibility. I mean, there is a whole list of coaches that if Indiana wants to push up into the next echelon and hire coaches who have demonstrated consistently that they, can be part of winning programs, they know how winning programs operate, I think there's a lot of options here. at IU's disposal. And IU, I'll say the same thing about IU football that I said several years ago about IU basketball. IU's got to stop treating itself like Juliet and start treating itself more like Aurora. This is not like it's not a death pact, where we're always going to be a bad football program. You have to think of it as, look, IU to some degree is an attractive job because of the money that's available, the lack of expectations, and the ability to build the program the way that you want to if you have the capacity to do so. That's actually, I think, a pretty attractive package if you're willing to pay the $6 or so million a year it's going to take to bring that type of a coach in. But why not at this point? Because if you don't do that as Indiana, what are you even doing with your football program?
The other thing, the other trope that just drives me bananas that I know will come up is if we end up hiring somebody like John Summerall, Troy or something, like somebody younger, you take a shot at it. This always comes up. And I think this is partially, I think the extension with Allen was right at the time, but it's something that comes up with IU football where there's this idea of like, man, but this is what I was going to say earlier when I cut myself off. But it's like, man, if you hire a young up and coming coach, like, God, you worry he's going to leave for a better program. And it's like, I always say to those people, like, name me the last time that happened. Because every coach at IU in my lifetime and even previous lifetimes has either been fired or has left or unfortunately passed away. Like there's no long history of us losing coaches to SEC schools. And by the way, like this is something, again, I think IU fans need to understand is you almost need to be confident in we are at that point where the first, if we nail this hire and it's somebody who's doing great, there's a very good chance that person sees greener pastures somewhere else and leaves. And that's a good thing. Then you just nail the next hire, and then you get to a point where you're kind of like Michigan State, where they not the bet like they had Saban. It's like they lost, but they finally got to a point where it's like we are now at least a destination where coaches want to stay where we're at, and we're not that stepping stone. To me, that is the next evolution. Not that I want to lose it, but I think it's so funny. Like you saw it with Allen, like after the first year, it's like, man, now we're going to lose the coach. It's like, well, we put the cart in front of the horse so many times in IU football. We haven't even hired a guy yet. And people are like, man, what if we lose him? It's like, let's get there first because it's never happened.
And look, here's the thing I think is important. You have to hire somebody that can galvanize a donor base that's never really been galvanized by football before. I mean, if you go back and look at all of the hires,
Hepner kind of was doing that.
Well, here's the thing. I think Hepner and Allen were more like they were the Vox Populi choices. They were really popular among the fans. I don't know how much either of them really resonated with the donors.
Fair.
And I think the complaints that Tom Allen had this offseason about like NIL money, it's like I hate to break it to everybody. There's plenty of NIL money for football. Like I never understood that particular complaint. Part of the problem, again, is I don't think people wanted to come play for Tom Allen. But the other problem is like your head coach has to be able to communicate a grander vision to your donors in order to get capital campaigns going, to get a new practice facility, to get all of these things. And you've just had a donor base at IU that's been burned time and time again. And look, things have changed since Bill Mallory had to go stump to like try to barely raise the money for the original indoor practice facility. It's a different world now, but you could argue that the intervening 30 years since that occurred have been among the worst statistically in IU football history. So like, what is it that IU fans or IU donors have had to get excited about over the course of this time? Or you've had coaches, I think Kevin Wilson falls into this category, that just didn't do that kind of glad handing particularly well. So, for all the people who are like, IU needs to invest in this and that, they do. But you have to have a coach that can come in and speak to the donor base and get them excited about the idea of IU football.
Great point.
And that, to me, that's where a lot of the names that I see people bandying about, like Jason Candle, the Toledo coach or whatever, it's like that's not. If you need money, if you need the money for facilities, if you need the money for NIL, that's where the extra money comes in and makes it much, much easier. If you've got someone who can go in and talk to donors and say, here's what we're trying to build. Here's the vision. I never felt that with Tom Allen. Tom Allen was all about LEO, breakthrough. Remember, that was the initial. That's not a strategy. That's a slogan. And that's, to me, the big difference with a lot of these things. And Cam Cameron was another one. Like, Cam Cameron, he had some of the best players in Indiana history on his rosters, and yet nobody was ever excited about the football program during that time period. They were excited about Antoine Randall, but they weren't excited about the football program because Cameron we just didn't have a personality that got people fired up. And I think that extended to donors as much as it extended to the individual fans. And so it's a tricky, thread to try to get through the needle. But I do think that with the names that we've just talked about, if you can find someone who can galvanize not just fans, but the people with money, now you're in a position where you can maybe start to build something special. And you're in a position now, we've talked about this before, you'd much rather be Indiana than a Big 12 school or an ACC school.
Oregon State.
Yeah, you'd rather be in the poorest house in the richest neighborhood than the richest house in the poorest neighborhood. Scott knows that all too well. I'm kidding. But that's how I would look at it. Like at this point, IU they're fortunate in that they joined the right club 120 some years ago in the Big Ten. And I think the idea was, gosh, it'd be great if Tom Allen could figure out a way to win even 5 games this year. That way you don't have to worry about this. You can push it forward to another year. But the program was moving backwards. Yeah. So how do you create the kind of interest, not just to get fans reinvested, because the fans were out. I mean, the fans didn't come to the last couple of games. We talked about how this was one of the least anticipated bucket games ever. The fans were out at this point.
It would have been wildly insane to watch the lack of interest.
So that would be my overall approach on all of this. Is like ultimately you're looking at IU's got the option here, and you can go to the table and you can say, look, we're handing you the keys to something that you can build. And that's where my hope is Indiana's going to be able to create that kind of buzz among potential coaches, where it's like, instead of, God, IU, awful place to go, don't want to have any part to do with that. It's like, if Scott Dolson and the hiring committee can say, we want to hire someone who's been part of a winning program, we want to set this up, we want to entrust that person, knowing that they have had success elsewhere, you have a much better chance of succeeding there than handing the keys to someone who's trying to figure out how to be a head coach at this level for the first time. I think that's ultimately what Indiana has to keep in mind as they move forward with this coaching search. It's interesting. Zach Osterman had a tweet that I thought was noteworthy, where he said, expect IU to move pretty quickly on this, in as much as they've gone into this eyes wide open on candidates, which, look, I'll say this, like, without divulging a whole lot, like, this was not a surprise to me. I had a lot of, I've been kind of mentioning to you and others, like, I think this is going to happen. You didn't think it was going to happen. So then it did happen. And it's like, well, I feel like Indiana in general, the atmosphere around the donor base, which I kind of have a loose connection with, I guess, there was clearly a change that happened after that Illinois loss. And it was like, at that point, I think Indiana really seriously was moving forward with this idea that they were going to make a change. So even though they haven't been public with things, I think they've been doing some work behind the scenes to figure out exactly, okay, what direction do they go? And I think by last weekend, as Patrick points out, it was pretty well known amongst people who were really paying attention to the tea leaves that this was probably going to take place. So I was mildly surprised they waited till Sunday to do it, but I'm not surprised that the news broke as early as it did on Sunday. And I think that they will probably move pretty quickly. I will push back on something that I saw. There was a tweet yesterday from Jake Query, who I generally like, but the idea that because IU didn't move earlier, that they lost out on someone like Jonathan Smith from Oregon State. And this is where I think you have to acknowledge that if you compare Michigan State and Indiana as jobs, Michigan State's going to win out every time. Like, right. Michigan State's been to a college football playoff. Michigan State, for as many problems as they have, they already have much of the structure for a winning football program. At IU, you have to build that. It's still going to be a more attractive job. Indiana's job could have been open a month ago. I think you're still going to lose out on someone like that if they really are choosing between Michigan State and Indiana. But the nice thing is, like, Michigan State's off the table, and Texas A&M is shopping for houses in an entirely different zip code than Indiana. And so you're now, I mean, think about it. You're positioned where you're going to be ahead of Oregon State. in the pecking order. You're going to be ahead of Syracuse in the pecking order.
Every school that's not a Big Ten or SEC school.
Yeah.
You just, well, again, if Indiana is going at this the right way and is willing to spend the money needed, then theoretically the only school you're competing with is Northwestern is going to be searching this off. It's like it's you and Northwestern, and I think that's a pretty fair comparison. But everyone else who's searching, if they're not in the Big Ten or the SEC, you should have more resources, and you should be Dion. That's funny. I just the comment here about Dion, but no, I mean you should be able to compete with anybody else. Like there's no reason why you saw it with Jonathan Smith. Like that's a prime example where it's like I think Oregon State and Michigan State right now are similar jobs, but one school is in the Big Ten and one school doesn't have a conference. And so you mentioned the coach at Arizona. Like that should be Indiana is more attractive than Arizona. It has nothing to do with their history or their recruiting base or anything. It's just like one school is in the Big Ten and one school is not. And there's a financial difference there as long as Indiana is willing to spend more than every other school that's not in the Big Ten or SEC, they should have their pick of the litter.
Yeah. We'll see what happens. Obviously, as we move forward, there's a lot to digest with all of this. I'm sure we'll hear some of the different commentary. You'll hear a lot of national commentators. We've already got a couple of them. They're like, well, Josh, IU can't afford a good roster, but they afforded $20 million to fire Tom Allen. IU fans, I think, just ignore all of that for now, and let's see what happens. I mean, I think to some degree the onus is on the athletic department to do something that they've not really done before here, which is make not a splash hire, but a hire that's going to move the program in a direction towards sustainability and try to build the structures that have needed to be here for a long time. There's no guarantee that they're going to succeed. They could pick the perfect person. It might not work out. As you and I have talked about, you alluded to it earlier, no one, when Tom Allen was given the extension that locked in this buyout, was thinking, wow, that's a terrible move, because it was coming off of 2 seasons that were among the best in IU history. Now, you can certainly, in retrospect, say that was a terrible idea. And it ended up being a terrible idea, but no one was screaming from the rafters at that time that it was a bad idea. So ultimately, I think there's a lot of good options on the table. There's people with Big Ten head coaching experience. There's people with major conference coaching experience. There's people like Kane Womack, who he's done very well at South Alabama. He certainly knows what it takes to have a winning program at IU because he was one of the coaches that was there for both of those seasons. I think there's a lot of good options on the table. I just hope Indiana doesn't make the mistake of going with someone who doesn't have that experience at this level, at the college level. Because we had a question from Levi here. What about former NFL coaches? I mean, the problem is
it's a different game. It's
a different game. I mean, as much as people have criticized Mike Woodson, I think Mike Woodson's adapted pretty well to the college game, but there's clearly some things that he could do better. College football is a completely different animal from the NFL. And that ultimately is, I think, not something that you can trade off as you go through these things. You can't just say, well, I've got coaching experience. You have to be able to recruit. You have to be able to talk to donors. You have to be able to get people excited about this. As Andy Stump brings up, it's the same sport. It's a completely different game. So it'll be fascinating, and we'll keep an eye on things as we move forward.
I want to say, just as a positive, if you're selling this out there, it's like it's not awesome, but it's like, the cupboard is not totally bare. Like, you looked at the way Sorsby played this year. He was a freshman. He played pretty well. I mean, more touchdowns than interceptions. Like, he showed some flashes. That's a freshman quarterback. You have Donovan McCulley. Like, there was a connection there in the second half of the year where if you're a coach come in, it's like, all right, like, I know I have a wide receiver. Again, assuming every those players you're able to re-recruit and keep them here. It's like, all right, you have a quarterback who's a sophomore who can start in Big Ten games and, at least compete at the games you need to. You have a wide receiver where they have a connection. You have a real good target. You have, your leading rusher is a sophomore. Like, there's some pieces there where it's not like totally bare or all seniors. So I also, again, I just don't think it's that. I think it's very short-term thinking and just kind of buying into the narrative too much to be like, oh man, I use a horrible job. Who would want to go there? It's like, no, there's pieces there and you're a Big Ten school.
I think that's a good way to leave it. As you said, there's pieces here. You got to get a new coach in. You want to keep the good pieces. You want to have Donovan McCulley as your WR1 next year. It'd be nice to build around Brendan Sorsby. I think he showed enough to deserve that, but there's a lot of holes to fill. And the one thing is, I mean, the other argument for doing it now, next year's schedule is really favorable. Like, It's not unreasonable that Indiana could win 6 or 7 games out of their first 8. I mean, go look at the schedule and you'll see what I'm talking about. Giving a new coach that kind of runway early on and giving them the opportunity to cook a little bit, get some momentum going, get the fans reinvested, that is as important as anything in all of this. And so that's what I'm really excited to see. There's going to be a lot to talk about as we move forward here, Scott. We really appreciate all you folks jumping on. We literally had just finished the Purdue podcast. We were going to sign off. We were going to do this tonight, and then the news broke, and I was like, Scott,
let's do it live.
You got to get it live. Let's make it happen. So for the 250 or so of you who have jumped on in the various channels throughout the course of this last hour, we really appreciate it. We will be back with more as news events warrant. So thank you all again for tuning in and chatting IU football with us. And we will chat with you again soon. If you haven't subscribed to our Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com, it's free. You'll get an email that notifies you when the podcasts are available. So please do that if you get a chance. Otherwise, Scott, good to chat with you. Folks, it's a new era of IU football. We'll see what that era brings. Quite a morning all the way around. But anyway, thanks to our sponsors, Home Field Apparel. Thanks to our friends at the Back Home Network. Thanks to all of you folks. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison and bring us a new coach. So long, everybody.